All right, everybody, welcome back to the Exploring the Blockchain podcast, where we document our experiences of learning about the blockchain, interview guests and experts in the space, and keep you updated on the latest trends in the industry. I'm your co-host, Zane.
And I'm Josh. Today we are joined by Felix, who's going to talk to us about DAOs, also known as Decentralized Autonomous Organizations. Thank you so much for joining us today. Can you start by telling us a little bit about your background and what brought you into the Web3 space?
Yeah, certainly. So, hi guys, it's a pleasure to be here. I have a kind of eclectic background, so I studied in the sciences when I was in college and was kind of a researcher and laboratory technician in psychopharmacology. Then from that, I went heavy into philosophy for another degree and then bounced around in kind of education and consulting and kind of quantitative psychology. So I found Web3 in part because I started knowing some people who had created NFT projects, and I saw that there was really a huge opportunity to do like nice things in the world in Web3. And before that, I had always I knew a lot of investors. I didn't know people who were kind of building DAOs organizations. And so when I realized that there's this tremendous potential to do good, and everybody thinks this is just like, a money grab kind of shit show, I was like, wow, there's a real like cognitive dissonance about what's going on here. And so that's when I decided to really commit myself, and now I'm more or less full time in Web3.
Cool. So maybe we can just start off by, if you want to talk a little bit about the basics of what a DAO is, what it means, how it can do good in the world, and maybe a little bit about also what DAOs you're part of and what DAOs you're excited about.
Certainly. So in my case, I'm a part of a few DAOs. I'm a core contributor at Juicebox, which is actually a DAO tooling protocol. So that basically gives certain tools to people who want to start DAOs or projects, and we can get into that. That's kind of really exciting. And then I'm also one of the core guys at Movement DAO, which is a DAO that's really trying to do these world-changing, positive kind of organizations and prop them up and get them to succeed. So I'm also a little involved in Choice DAO, which is a reproductive rights DAO, and a few others. But those are kind of the two heavy ones. And in my capacity, I'm mainly like a writer. I do a lot of marketing, and I also host the Movement DAO podcast. So in terms of how DAOs are unique, I would say, and I will tell you, anybody you see in the Web3 world who has this figured out doesn't have it figured out. Like people don't agree on this. So you're getting my opinion. But I would say that at its core, a DAO has everything to do with governance, and governance is a problem that in 3,500 years we have not figured out as humans. So Web3 is trying to approach this problem in a new way, and the way they're doing it is a DAO. You'll hear a lot of buzzwords around DAO. People will say, it's a flat hierarchy, right? So you'll hear these almost like Nietzschean oxymorons around DAOs. So what does that mean? And their point is it's leaderless, but at the same time, we know human hierarchies can't be leaderless. So it's like there's a lot of this kind of doublespeak happening. But I would say that the strongest central tenet of a DAO is probably that it needs a token. And that's really where the blockchain part of it comes in. When you look at DAOs that are structured, they're all structured around voting rights. These are usually determined by tokens. And the tokens, of course, are this kind of product of, Web3 technology. And they're very powerful because you can track them, you can use them as a voting power. So I would say one thing also interesting for a lot of people who aren't used to this, in DAOs generally, governance is not like one-to-one, I would say. For Western liberal democracy, votes are one-to-one, and you don't get to give your vote to someone else. And when you do vote, that's anonymous. Like you could tell me you're going to vote for my guy, but once you walk in that box, like I don't know who you voted for. In DAOs, and they're not all this way, but a lot of them, you have voting by tokens. So somebody is a big contributor to a DAO. They throw in $1,000. They get, let's say they get one-to-one, they get 1,000 tokens. You throw in $10. That person has 10 times the strength of voting that you do. That's a very common kind of schema. You also have what's called quadratic voting, which tries to mitigate the obvious cons of that, which is a whole other can of worms. Then you do have also one-to-one voting. So I guess the picture I'm painting is that, it's very broad what a DAO is. The easiest definition is that it's definitely connected with a token. It's a group of people that more or less agree there shouldn't be executive hierarchy and that they prefer more kind of a diffuse team work environment.
What a great explanation. Can you tell us a little bit more about Juicebox and how it's used by DAOs to facilitate the flow of money into these like important projects?
Yeah, so Juicebox is we talk about this all the time at Juicebox. It's interesting because it would be so easy. What people will tell you about Juicebox in specific is they'll tell you, well, imagine it's like Kickstarter but for DAOs. But that's not really a fair explanation. There's no Web2 equivalent to what Juicebox is. But the best way to describe it, the way I describe it, coming from, I had a long background not in Web3, is when you open, let's say, a business, you have to juggle your money, right? You hire somebody who knows QuickBooks or whatever, and they're like your accounting person, or your accounts payable, receivable. And what Juicebox essentially is, and that's called a treasury, right? That's like the person running your treasury. And your treasury can, operate at a profit or a loss, but that's like where all the money goes, and then somebody figures out what to do with it and how to pay people and so on. So Juicebox essentially gives you a programmable treasury, and it allows you to mint tokens. So let's say you want to start a business. You're starting, I don't know, an ice cream shop, and you're taking crypto. Now, all the ice cream money you get goes into your, crypto treasury, which is your Juicebox treasury. Now, also, people might support you and say, you know what, I want to support you, and I'm going to throw in some of my money in there. So that also goes in the treasury. What you can do ahead of time is you can set on certain days, like let's say you want a 12-day pay scale. Every 12 days, money gets dispersed. Every 12 days, that will automatically happen on Juicebox. You can set that ahead of time. With the tokens, there's also this in tandem operation where, let's say, I can say, well, if people give me money, I want to give them tokens. You can also decide how many tokens they should get. You can decide if you're always going to give the same amount of tokens. Let's say you're doing a startup, you want early contributors to get rewarded more. You might say that people who contribute in my first kind of pay cycle, they should get more tokens than who does the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth to reward your ground floor people. So it's basically a tooling suite that does all of that. And then there's this very unique concept called overflow, which is kind of like when you're doing well, you declare on Juicebox, like for my ice cream shop, I need 4 grand a month to run that. Now let's say people just like your ice cream and start throwing money at you, and you're getting like 10 grand a month. That 6 grand doesn't go to you as profit, which would be in a classic kind of capitalist model. You would just say, well, I got an extra 6 grand. In Juicebox, that extra 6 grand sits in your treasury, and that's called overflow. That means that now if you're sitting with 1,000 tokens, you can you can basically trade in your tokens and declare a piece of that overflow and get that back out if you wanted to. And that's kind of the really unique concept of Juicebox that's kind of hard to explain in layman's terms.
So I want to ask you about something you mentioned, which is like this idea of like a voting structure, and you talked about like quadratic voting. One of the things I've wondered about DAOs for a very long time is, one of the great things about DAOs is that it's decentralized. It doesn't need a central hierarchy or a central leadership. But if tokens are freely tradable, can't I just buy more tokens? Isn't it kind of like a rich get richer type of situation where the rich people, they can just put more money, they're going to get more tokens, and then they get more voting power? How does that work?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And that's kind of the biggest obvious criticism of the system is, you can bully people, right, by buying more votes. And to a certain extent, that's true. I can certainly, if I'm sitting on more money than you are, and I have to vote on something, I can commit a lot of that money to tokens and say, well, I'm gonna outmuscle your specific vote. And there's a few ways that that gets addressed, and different places address it differently. And truthfully, a lot of places don't address it at all. And then that's not a great situation. So one thing you can do, which Juicebox I believe has this, which is terrific, um, to mitigate against what's called like a 51% attack, right? So what if somebody, you know, amasses 51% of the tokens and your threshold is 50%? Now suddenly they can just like drain the whole treasury and run away, which is called a rug pull, right? So how do you stop that from happening? There's a few ways. So one thing is that the affirmative threshold in a lot of DAOs is high. Like in Juicebox, I think it's 66%. So something has to pass with a high threshold. That's one mitigation strategy. The other one is to say that people can trade in their tokens against overflow, right? So the most brilliant measure, and Juicebox does this, I'm pretty sure, very elegantly, is let's say you throw in money to get the Juicebox token so that you can take over the entire treasury. The Juicebox treasury, I think, is $10 or $12 million. It's in ETH, so it kind of depends as ETH goes up and down. Um, But at any rate, so let's say you did that. Now, in order to amass that many tokens, you would have to pour in millions and millions of dollars, right? So the moment that we see someone do that, we can throw our tokens in and redeem them, right? And so it's almost like a self-destruct mechanism. All of the members can say, fine, if you're dumping in 30 or 40 million dollars to get all the tokens, because now the tokens are more, they cost more, right? Because Juicebox has been around for like a year. So early on, they didn't cost much. Now they cost more. So where early on, I let's say, got $1,000 worth of tokens and I got 10,000 tokens, now that $1,000 might only get me 500, right? Those numbers are not accurate, just to make the point. So now you come and you throw in like 30 or 40 million dollars into our treasury and you get 67% of the tokens. Before that vote takes place, I can trade in my tokens and basically make a killing. And I'm basically draining the treasury. I'm draining everything you did, and your vote will pass, but there's not going to be any money left. So that's the most elegant solution that I'm aware of that Juicebox employs. And admittedly, that would destroy the DAO, but it would also completely kill your capital.
Interesting. I was wondering why you'd use a DAO instead of a normal, like what we would use, a nonprofit or an NGO for these really important causes.
Yeah. So I'll try, and as I said, I'm doing my best to answer, not being an expert on all of these matters, but where I see the strength is, for instance, in activist causes. So one of the places I'm also a core team member on is called the Peace DAO. The Peace DAO tries to address the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so how does it do that? It tries to, in the Peace DAO's case, it's looking for small grassroots organizations in Ukraine that can't get funding from large organizations, and it wants to give them funding and highlight all the good they're doing. And it does that effectively. Now, let's say you give money to an organization like Peace DAO. When you give money, you get tokens. What do the tokens let you do? Well, they let you vote. So at Peace DAO, there's several humanitarian organizations that want money. Now, we're not making executive decisions that only this one's going to get it. However, other big humanitarian causes do that, right? I mean, you're hoping the executives of Red Cross make the right decision. You have no say. Red Cross wants your money. They don't want your opinion. So a small humanitarian organization like Peace DAO can say, okay, here we have this method for voting. We have members that actually want to take part in this. We use the tokens to vote, and we say, well, here's 5 different charities. We vetted them all. Like, none of them are bullshit. None of them are just going to try to, take your money and run. But, they're all doing different stuff, and you let the community take part in that. So that's one obvious reason in kind of a nonprofit way where I think a DAO is very unique.
Yeah, that was a great explanation. Let's talk a little bit about like tracing money in DAOs. Like a lot of the things that people say is great about the blockchain is that like it's public and you can like see all this stuff, right? It's all accessible to the average person. Can you talk a little bit about that and the benefits of having that in an organization? Because I think one of the complaints about other types of organizations that aren't on the blockchain is once you put in the money, you don't know where it goes. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that and how DAOs address that.
Well, so certainly, I mean, the part of this answer I'm not qualified to give that has to do with how the blockchain works, and obviously, you can't, if you go back after the fact and try to edit the blockchain. I mean, it's very obvious that that happened, and because it's a distributed ledger, the other ones outcompete it, and so that problem is more. I hesitate to say solved, but it's not a real problem DAOs are experiencing. Where it's very valuable is, um, you know, again, I make this argument all the time with Peace DAO and with humanitarian causes. I don't see a reason that a nonprofit would not want their checkbook open and would not want to show where every penny is going. There are cases where it's a problem, but if you're trying to deliver food aid somewhere, I mean, you shouldn't have an issue saying this is how much we got, this is how much administrative overhead cost, and this is how much it cost on the ground, to coordinate, and this is how much was left at the end, because it's in your best interest if you're operating fairly and honestly to make that information available so that it can get audited by whoever wants to audit it. Now, where that becomes a problem is, in and actually this is even true in nonprofits, but in especially private businesses, let's say I don't know, so let's say I'm running again, we'll keep it in a nonprofit world. I'm running a humanitarian thing, helping aid for Ukraine, and I'm in talks with X, Y, and Z celebrity who wants to partner with this, and a little money can exchange hands, to get this going, or there's meetings. Now, none of that can necessarily be transparent because you don't want to blow the lid off a potential partnership. And so you can imagine outside of the nonprofit world in business, where you have a lot of proprietary stuff going on. Again, you know, I always use the example like I remember I had a professor once who told this story in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan had already had Alzheimer's and he was president. And this was a secret for obvious reasons because he was the commander in chief. And the professor had told us that everybody in the department had kind of realized this because they saw all this money from the State Department going into Alzheimer's research. And it just came out of nowhere and it was a ton. It was like research as hard as you want, like the money's not running out. And so most people in that field just put the pieces together based on seeing that inflow of money. And so that's a case where you don't want that transparency. Now, that being said, a DAO can make the choice. It's not like a DAO has to operate transparently and openly, and plenty of them don't. But I see there's more reasons for that than against it.
Yeah, traceability is definitely one of the an important factor for a DAO. I was wondering, why would someone want to own? Are there any other benefits to owning a token other than getting to vote on governance?
Yeah, so with the tokens, I mean, I think the governance is the most powerful. I think the tokens also have a tremendous kind of symbolic power in the sense of like let's say you're doing a like now so with Assange is a good example, right? Like let's say you really think Julian Assange is a guy, the United States wants to get him as a spy. A lot of people think he didn't do anything wrong. Now a lot of people have the kind of free Assange campaign. So let's say you're doing something like that and you just want to acknowledge the contributors to this campaign, you could give them like badges, right? The tokens can be badges. I mean, that's another case for NFTs. The NFTs can just be badges. I was one of the first supporters of X, Y, or Z. So they have that value. Now, there's definitely, when you get into where you get into a legal problem, is when people start using tokens, as a tradable commodity. In other words, as a security. And that's a problem, and that should not happen. I mean, unless a place declares it, fine. But that's that's I think one of the biggest issues now with regulation is that, you know, if somebody's using a token for governance, it's fine. But once you start using a token like a commodity or security, I mean, first of all, that's not allowed. But second of all, that also kind of totally takes away from all of its power. I think most of its power is social.
Kind of bouncing off what you're saying, this idea of DAOs being like a social cause, being using DAOs as as a method for change. Um, I want to ask you about Choice DAO. I think and not even just Choice DAO, but all of these, Klima DAO, all these DAOs that are trying to do good things in the world and using DAOs as a method of capital formation. Have you seen DAOs, successful in raising capital for these type of causes? Have you seen, communities, rally around certain DAOs? Do we still need to get there in terms of being able to solve these big issues with DAOs? What's some of the successes you've seen, and how are these type of DAOs doing?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of different ones. You have wildly successful kind of one-offs. For instance, Constitution DAO raised, I don't know, 35 million, $40 million. Assange DAO raised, I think, $53 million. Those were both Juicebox DAO projects, by the way, in terms of Juicebox's tooling. Now, those are kind of one-off money raise DAOs. And yeah, they were effective. They raised tremendous, tremendous money. There are some DAOs out there that are quite successful. I mean, I'm thinking of Nori. Nori is a carbon sequestration DAO that is really unique. Or there's one near and dear to my heart that's actually just launching, which is called Carbon Collectible NFTs. That's run by a guy named Mark Lawrence. And that also tries to address carbon offsets. And how successful are they raising money? It's very hard to say. I mean, it's like any business. Some businesses raise more than others. I mean, like Choice DAO launched last week. In their first day, I think they raised like $6,000 or $7,000. That's not an insignificant amount of money. If you're doing activism, that's great. I mean, Peace DAO, we had a dinner in Peace DAO that was hosted by our founder, and I think that made $17,000. So, you know, most places are not like the Assange DAO, Constitution DAO that immediately raise millions. And unfortunately, a lot of the ones that are kind of BS, right? And they're selling like an NFT or something. But that being said, it's still, it's nothing to kind of like turn away from. I mean, if you're making a few grand or in a dinner making 10 or 15 grand, particularly if you're not like Peace Now, we're not trying to compete with Red Cross. Our whole point is that we can do way more with way less. So really, I mean, like, 10 or 15 grand goes a tremendous way if you're supporting small grassroots organizations. If you're Choice DAO and you raise 5 or 10 grand in your first month, or 20 or 30 grand, and you're supporting small little abortion clinics that can barely pay the bills, for those abortion clinics, that's a huge amount of money. So most of the DAOs that I've found, they're not really like, oh, we just want to get to millions and millions of dollars, because they're not profit driven. At least the DAOs that I deal with, who try to kind of fix things, they're rarely profit driven, or they have kind of a regenerative finance model where the profit goes into supporting other parts of the DAO, with the hope that like this whole kind of money swirls around and helps as many people as possible.
Right. Um, First of all, thank you so much for coming on. I have one last question for you before you go. I was wondering, who are the people primarily running the DAOs, and also who's buying these tokens? Is it young people? Is it millennials? You know.
Yeah, in that sense. Well, the first question is almost a trick question, right? Because technically nobody runs the DAO because it's a DAO. Um, I would say in most DAOs that I've noticed, and again, I'm not like a seasoned DAO expert, but just from my personal experience, the people early on in the formation, they tend to have a lot of the voting weight, and so I think they also socially, people tend to listen to them. But in a DAO, you won't find a lot of like, you do this or that kind of attitude. Even work-wise, you show up and you say, okay, like I'm a marketer. Like nobody's gonna say, okay, we need, this and this, and go do it. Like you just kind of start doing stuff, and if people think it brings value, then you kind of get closer and closer to the core team. Um, so yeah, it's hard to say who runs it, except I would say just based on human psychology, socially, people defer to others. If Solidity devs are talking about shit, I listen to them and I assume they know what they're talking about. Again, that's not an infallible system, but that's also not so different than the real world. In terms of the types of people who come in, it depends on the DAO, and it's also, again, it has to do with the ambiguity about the token. Like people who kind of get what DAOs are, they're not like trying to buy tokens for the sake of it. They're not treating tokens like a commodity because they're not. But you do have people who just they're like, oh my God, I have to buy all these tokens, and they think that these tokens are gonna lead somewhere, and there are some really sketchy kind of DAOs or organizations that might say that, but that's I mean, first of all, that's dangerous territory that nobody should go in. But you have people like I'm thinking Assange DAO was this case, and Assange DAO suddenly there was a tremendous amount of foreign investment into their DAO, and I don't think those investors knew really much about Julian Assange or anything. They probably just thought, oh, this is an opportunity to buy all these tokens, and they're going to be worth something. And so that's a problem. So sometimes you get that, but I would say most of the people that I deal with day to day, they're on the younger side. I mean, I would say under 30, many around 25, and there's some really young people too, who are like 18, 19 years old getting into it. And then you have some older school people that hang around, but I would say the bulk of the people are probably under 30.
Cool. That makes a lot of sense. Hey, that's it. Thank you so much for your insightful answers to our questions. DAOs are super
Yeah,
interesting, and we really wanted to do an episode just focused on DAOs for a long time, and happy that you could come and talk about it. So
awesome.
thank you for coming on.
My pleasure, guys. Good luck with the podcast. It was a pleasure being here.
And is there anywhere people can find you if they want to learn more about you or?
Yeah, so I guess well, my Twitter handle is at real Felixander, and I mean, I have some articles up. I sent you links, so you can, if you want to put that in the description, that's totally fine.
Awesome. Cool. We'll do. Thank you, sir.